Rabbinic Literature at Leobeck College and visiting lecturer at King's College London.
I'm Sari Kislevsky, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Queen's College, CUNY.
I'm Ken Ehrenberg, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Research Associate Professor of Law at the University at Buffalo, SUNY.
Today what we're doing is engaging in a live pseudo-Talmudic discussion of a sugya, that is, a problem, a real halachic question that is bothering the three of us. The texts that you're looking at are Mishnah Sanhedrin 9:6, and then two Talmudic interpretations, elucidations, explorations, discussions of their problems, their sugyot, with this Mishnah, one in Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud, and one in Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. The problem that we have a text here that says that zealots can kill a Jewish man who is having sexual relations with a Gentile woman. What does it mean, can? And why is a rule regarding zealots in a rabbinic legal code? The Yerushalmi is going to say, we reject this act. At least they're going to reject what Pinchas did in Numbers 25, which is he killed an Israel man for having sexual relations with a Gentile woman. Now the Bavli's first question is, what if the zealots don't get the guy? What is the rabbinic framework or responsibility for this problem? Now, maybe we can start by dealing with how Yerushalmi deals with it, which is to reject it. And the Gemara there asks, how is it possible that the rabbis can oppose what Pinchas did? Didn't God speak in favor of Pinchas, which in fact he does in Numbers 25? What is our problem? The problem is, in fact, the rabbis maintain an opposition to Pinchas, but there's nothing they can do about it because the divine speaks in his support. The question is, what does this mean for understanding of law and authority in these texts?
Now, I have a question. When you say the divine speaks in favor of Pinchas, don't we have other examples that are at least famous in the literature that I even have kind of come into the literature and secular legal philosophy about how the rabbis don't necessarily always listen to the voice from heaven?
No, that's absolutely true. In this case, though, the voice from heaven trumps the will of the sages. This could be because the voice from heaven gives Pinchas the eternal priesthood. So by opposing that, maybe the sages would be opposing the existence of a priesthood.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on the problem. So the problem is that we have the rabbis telling us something about what the zealots can and can't do, where ordinarily zealots are people or a group of people over whom they don't have jurisdiction to tell them what they can and can't do. Is that the idea? And so we want to know, well, why do we have this passage coming from the rabbis about, asserting their authority to let the zealots do what they want?
Exactly. I mean, I think the rabbis would think that they do have authority. If a zealot does something that's counter to rabbinic law, then in theory, at least they have authority over them. I think my reading would be that the zealot doesn't think that the rabbi has any authority over them. If we use Pinchas in Numbers 25 as a model for zealotry, he goes directly to God. He feels the same anger that God feels and the same jealousy and acts in the same destructive manner that God would act in that.
Does that imply necessarily, why does that imply that the zealot doesn't feel that the rabbis have any authority over him? I mean, he may be in a position of not feeling like he's in control of his actions because of his zealous, defense of the law, so to speak. So, I mean, he's more of a vigilante who is overcome by emotion or something like that and can't necessarily control himself, which doesn't necessarily mean that he's denying the rabbinic authority.
Oh, as if he were a zealot against his will.
Possibly.
That's a really interesting idea because that raises a whole other set of problems of authority, right? Because it talks about, it invokes problems of authority over yourself. In which case, if you don't have authority over yourself, no one else is going to have authority to tell you how to exercise your authority over yourself.
Well, I suppose that would be an example of a classic example of an excuse, as opposed to a justification. I mean, we're seeing it usually. The zealot might want to offer the law and doing God's will as a justification for what he's doing, meaning that he's doing the right thing, even if it were to go against the law or the authority of the rabbis. But if he's saying that he can't control his actions, then he's saying that he has an excuse, which is that I can't stop myself, so you can't hold me responsible.
So one thing, though, that's very interesting about this is that this problem, I take it, raises both issues simultaneously. So both the issue of authority over yourself and the way excuses might or might not function in rabbinics, and a further question about whether rabbis can have the authority to tell zealots what to do in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're zealots, they're renegades. The rabbis don't exercise, they don't recognize the rabbinic authority.
Well, I think that's a quick assumption, though, to say because they're renegades, because they're zealots, they're renegades, and because they're renegades, they don't recognize the rabbinic authority. I'm not sure I'm not sure we should make that assumption.
To problematize the issue, not to as the final conclusion over the issue.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand it. Like I'm trying to understand the map of the issues that we're looking at.
Because we could just. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Liliv.
No, I think this is an important question, because in Numbers 25 and also in some of the later Midrashic literature and also in Bavli, there's a real contrast between Pinchas sees what's happening and goes and acts on it, versus the courts, which are actually at this time deliberating over capital punishment regarding the Israelites who engaged in idolatry with the Moabite women at Shittim.
Mm-hmm.
And there are actually some midrashim that suggest that Moses is himself deliberating about whether or not Zimri can be with this Midianite woman in this other case, in this moment, right? And that's why we see in Bavli that Zimri brings a Midianite woman in front of Moses and challenges him directly and says, is she permitted or forbidden? In other words, what is the halacha on this? And the halacha is either hidden from Moses or disappears from him or he forgets it. And Zimri then pushes it, and he says, well, if you say that she's forbidden, which we assume would be the answer, then who permitted Zipporah to you? Because, of course, Moses himself is married to a Midianite woman. So there's a real problem there. And one of the Midrashim says Pinchas is dissatisfied with the fact that Moses is, confused and can't remember, and they're trying to deliberate how to deal with Zimri and Cosby,
Mm-hmm.
and he just bypasses all of this due process, all of this rabbinic beit din, the halachic thinking, right, and just kills them.
Because he sees a crime in progress, basically. He knows what the law is, and rather than all the ins and outs of the Beit Din and the procedural hurdles that have to be overcome, he sees the crime in progress, and he takes the law into his own hands. Putting aside whether he's in control of that, the fact that he's taking the law into his own hands doesn't necessarily mean he would say that the court doesn't have the authority to issue a judgment. And I'm talking about what's his name? Pinchas, right? So Pinchas isn't going to turn around and then say after he's done, and I did it because I don't think the court has the authority to make a judgment necessarily. Although maybe later on, as we're going to see in the Talmud, they're going to say, well, the result of having this passage in the Torah is that it essentially takes that authority away from the Beis Din to make the judgment.
I just wanted to keep track of the discussion a little bit, to be perfectly clear in my attempt to draw a map of the issues. So we have the zealots see a crime in progress, and we're not sure, they may or may not be taking the law into their own hands. The rabbis are saying something about it. They may or may not be trying to exercise their authority over him legitimately or illegitimately. We're still not sure. But we also want to distinguish this case, I think, from cases of something like self-defense or even third-party self-defense, right? And citizens' arrests, which are cases where it is legitimate to take the law into your own hands, and those aren't quite as problematic as this is.
Oops, she's gone. I'm going to pause the recording.
Okay, so I think you lost me, but just to recap. So we want to distinguish this case, which we want to locate, but we don't know exactly where, But it's not a clear case of self-defense, including third-party self-defense on the one hand, and it's not a clear case of citizen's arrest. Okay? On the other hand, which are cases where the law does allow you to, for good reason, to take the law into your own hands.
Let me just say one thing on that point, which is that I think that you need to make a distinction, or maybe this is the distinction you had in mind even, which is that this is about executing judgment and punishment in one fell swoop, whereas those cases are cases in which the law allows the citizen either allows the citizen to avoid judgment and punishment, or allows the citizen to simply, in a citizen's arrest type of case, bring the person before the judicial apparatus, which is not the same thing as actually giving the right to execute the judgment and punishment to a specific individual.
One issue that we might want to think about then is that it seems very odd for the law not just to authorize this kind of action, but to authorize punishment, that private punishment, which seems.
See, I don't think that's quite as odd. I mean, it seems odd to us from our perspective in, let's say, this modern legal community that we have. But if we think back a little bit in history, I don't think it's quite as odd as you think. I mean, we had periods in our history where people were routinely deputized to go after known outlaws in the West and things like that. And even in those cases, they weren't necessarily deputized. There would just be a general kind of posse type of situation. And you can imagine legal systems in which the right to execute judgment is given over to non-officials in certain circumstances, such it would be analogous to that. I mean, it's not such a stretch, really.
Let me ask about that actually, Ken. So the cases I can think of that sort are the law authorizing a private right of punishment in cases of revenge or something. Like
sure.
If I saw you sleeping with my wife,
then
I have the right to go after you personally because of the personal insult.
Right. Now, that's not our.
Can I just say something quickly there? I think this is exactly that kind of situation where the personal insult is an insult to God. God is betrayed, and God is jealous and furious, and Pinchas feels this emotion. This is in Numbers 25, mind you. He's the only one who feels this emotion, and he's compelled by that emotion to go and kill them.
Right.
So maybe we can understand on an analogy to third-party self-defense, this would be third-party private punishment in meting out revenge or something, as if you're acting on my behalf when I'm so insulted that I saw you sleeping with my spouse or
right.
something like that.
The only thing I want to.
I'm not doing the punishment, you're doing it on my behalf.
The only thing I want to make as a distinction here is I don't want, when you're thinking, and maybe this is what you're thinking of, I don't think we're comparing it to, let's say, the American legal system's, quote unquote, right of revenge when you see someone sleeping with your spouse, because that would simply be in a case of excuse. I don't think they're actually giving over authority for people to, execute each other in those cases. But perhaps in other legal systems, you hear about honor killings and things like that in certain parts of the world. Maybe it's closer to something like that, a legal system that has enshrined a certain kind of honor killing as a result of certain conditions being met. I mean, at the same time, and this is something that maybe we should get back to the text with, there are some questions about whether or not and under what conditions someone would have a right to bring someone like Pinchas or the zealot before the Beis Din after having executed this judgment. And so certain conditions, according to the Talmud, have to be met, if I remember correctly, in order for the zealot to be able to execute judgment without having himself become liable to further punishment from the Beis Din for overstepping his authority. So it is still about the ceding of authority to the zealot.
I think. Can I just actually? I'd like to just sort of frame this back to our text so we can keep track of these discussions in relation to our text for a second.
Yeah.
I think this idea of the honor killing is also really interesting. The Sugya and the Bavli, the Sugya has God link Pinchas's action to the killing of Shrem and his entire community in the story of Dinah and Genesis. And that is, we can easily frame that as an honor killing. And that Pinchas's act is framed within this tradition of, we would call it, this righteous kind of anger. And I think what's happening in Bavli is they're reframing the zealot, changing him from an emotional protector of God's dignity into someone who is very familiar with rabbinic law and has miracles that aid him in his legitimately able to defend himself against Pinchas' attack.
Right. Which section? Can you remember where exactly in the Bavli we're talking about, the Babylonian Talmud? It's Sanhedrin 81b.
Yeah, that should be Sanhedrin 81b. Do you want to pause it for a second?
Yeah.
No, but we've covered a lot of ground. I'm wondering if we should stop and try to digest this much and see what bubbles up, and then see if we can make more progress in the problem.
Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.